Hey all, and welcome back to Fuzzy Ducksy Gaming and a full and detailed guide to league starting with a Lightning Strike Raider in 3.17. Now just to reassure people, I played this build last league in trade and in SSF, and in the SSF playthrough I completed all the invitations except the Feared, and that was only because I couldn't get a Cortex map to drop. It's done Cirrus A9 multiple times and Maven, and this was in around 60 to 70 hours of playtime. Now the guide is detailed, so if you're experienced feel free to skip to the relevant sections, but I do recommend you watch the entire video. The guide's going to start off with some highlights from the last league. The first section of the highlights is from the SSF playthrough, and the second set of highlights is from a character I geared up in standard to represent a trade league character. Now the only reason I use standard is because I've been mainly SSF this year, so didn't have the currency in trade to build some of the items. The gear in the standard character is nothing crazy, and there'll be a POB for it to show that, and it's certainly achievable if you want to make it your own character, and if anything that gear can be improved on quite a lot. So enough waffling from me, let's jump into the highlights. So let's talk about the build and go into the basics of the skill, how it functions, and the pros and cons of the build. So let's start with the skill gem itself. So Zeal Lightning Strike is a melee skill with a secondary projectile attack. When you strike with a melee weapon, along with dealing a melee attack and damage, it also releases projectiles from the weapon. The Zeal gem contains a separate skill which repeatedly casts Zeal Lightning Strike from a static position, and you can have up to 2 charges. Now please ensure that you use both portions of the skill because the Zeal part is a massive portion of boss DPS. So as seen in the footage here, I've got Lightning Strike assigned to my right mouse button and then Zeal Lightning Strike to spacebar. For bosses, you want to use both Zeal charges and then your normal Lightning Strike for maximum burst damage. Try not to have any other Zeal gems in your gear as they all share souls, so the more Zeal skills you have socketed, the longer Zeal Lightning Strike will take to come back, which makes a huge difference in multi-boss invitations. Lightning Strike also has the benefit of being able to hit an enemy twice if you position correctly. For all of you playing long enough to remember the old Ancestral Call trick, it works exactly the same. So in the footage here, you can see me deliberately positioning slightly away from the enemy to ensure that I hit twice. Now don't worry, you don't have to be super specific on this, you just have to make sure you're not standing directly on top of the enemy. So with Pierce on projectiles and striking an additional target from melee, the build clearing becomes a breeze as you hit 2 enemies at once, and your projectiles will then travel through enemies and destroy a lot of the screen. With the combination of crit chance on your weapon, extra elusive effect and passives from the tree, the build easily gets to 90% plus crit chance. Combine this with the Raider Ascendancy with lots of evasion, spell suppression and ailment immunity, along with the effect of elusive buff, the build feels both tanky and really zooby, and personally for me it never gets boring. Now you can ignore the timestamps in the intro if you're playing in trade, as you should be able to get to all these bosses much quicker, but in SSF I didn't have the luxury of buying anything like gear, maps, frags or scarabs to speed up my progression, so I had to drop all the specific items to be able to spawn the bosses. We're going to cover in more detail how to build each area and how to level, but before we do, let's go on and talk about the pros and cons of the build. From the pros, it's very League Start and SSF friendly. There's nothing too complex or outrageous needed to get the build to the level you see in the video. It can be scaled to huge levels with investment. It's got really fast clear speed, and when you get used to the build, it's got amazing burst damage. Lightning Strike MTX also I think is one of the better looking MTXs. And obviously that's important when you're playing a build, it's got to look good. It's also tanky if you build the character correctly. But let's move on to the major cons of the build. The first is that it does require a few buttons, so if it's your very first build it might not be for you. The build itself has what I call a slow gradual build up. And by this I mean that each item of the build that you get improves the character a small to moderate amount, and most of the items are going to be needed to take on endgame content comfortably. There is little physical mitigation on the build, which you need to be aware of. So you need to make sure you're paying attention to big telegraphed physical attacks, because if they get through your evasion, there is a very good chance you're going to get one shot. However, once you get used to how the build plays, it sort of becomes a second nature. And in the last SSF playthrough I didn't die until I took on Awaken at 8 when I was slightly undergeared. It is a popular build, which can be a pro or a con. There is a pro to being a popular build, and that there's lots of people to help and discuss ideas with. The negative in Trade League is that the more popular a build gets, the more expensive the items get. However, we will cover up how to gear everything on your own if things become too expensive. And then lastly, for the quickest league start, you realistically need to use a different skill to level. In 3.16 it was Spectral Helix. The reason for this is that Vile Lightning Strike, like any other melee gem, feels pretty Z DPS until you get a few things running. And that covers the build overview, so let's move on to class and Ascendancy. So as slightly given away in the video title, we're playing as a Ranger and then we're ascending as Raider. Raider gives us everything we want for this kind of build. So we get frenzy charges for attack and movement speed, we get 40% spell suppression chance, 50% ailment avoidance, we get 20% enemy exposure to elemental damage, and we get lots of extra benefits for frenzy charges. The order of Ascendancy is really up to you, and as long as you end up with these 4 Ascendancy nodes, it really is dependent on what you want earlier in the build. The way I personally like to go without having to respec is I go Way of the Poacher for early frenzy charges, then I go Quartz Infusion for phasing and spell suppression. For the 3rd Ascendancy, I take Avatar of the Veil. I think it's important to have this when you do Uber Lab, as the 20% exposure helps a lot with damage. It also means in early maps you can become ailment immune and have full spell suppression by just getting a decent shield and some nodes on the tree. Then finally, after Uber Lab, you take Avatar of the Slaughter for lots of juicy bonuses based off frenzy charges. For Bandits, unless you're playing hardcore, I'd recommend killing all. Mana regen is not worth it, as we get mana gained on hit pretty early on, and although resistances are nice, it's not worth having in softcore to then have to spend 20 regret orbs to respec later on in the game. For Pantheons, I like to run Soul of Arakali for some protection against damage over time, and I like to run Yugal for curse reduction. Now when you've unlocked all of the extra bits in all of the Pantheons, you're going to choose them based on the map mods. So if there's Burning Ground, you would run Abaras. So let's move on to the gems. So we'll start with the main 6 link, which is Vile Lightning Strike. And your 6 gems for here are Vile Lightning Strike, Nightblade Support, either Awakened or Normal added Cold, or Awakened and added Lightning. I'll come on to discuss which one you should run in a moment. You want Awakened Elemental Damage with attacks or Normal Elemental Damage with attacks. You want Trinity, and you want Inspiration Support. Now there are a few different options for 6 links which we'll discuss shortly, and these obviously go in your chest armor. So we're not going to cover Vile Lightning Strike because we've gone through that gem and what it does. So the first support gem that we'll come and talk about is Nightblade Support. This is easily the strongest gem in the build. It offers elusive and increased crit chance, and it is definitely the single biggest damage multiplier in the build. You have to run this gem as it stacks with all the other elusive effects that we pick up on the tree. I'll just show an example of how strong this gem is and the extra effects. If you look in Path of Building and you untick the elusive box from the build, the DPS plummets. The next gem is a flat elemental damage gem to boost your damage up. It's either going to be added cold or added lightning. We run this because flat gems, since they nerfed the more damage gems, have come into their own a bit more and they're definitely worthwhile running in a build. If we run added cold, it gives us a ton of flat cold damage, which means we can chill higher. As shown in this clip against Shaper, we really slow down the speed that he commits his slam, and that's because we've got 25% chill on him. And this is an enemy, according to the description, that can't be fully slowed. We're then using Inspiration. This is a gem that gives you an inspiration charge every time you use your main skill, and you can have up to 5 charges. And each charge gives you a small amount of increased crit chance and elemental damage. Now the main reason for using this gem is it lowers the cost of the skill, making it much nicer to play and meaning we can run to tighter mana requirements. The next gem, which was nerfed in the last few leagues, but actually when you look at POBs it's still one of the highest damage, is Elemental Damage with attacks, or if you're rich or lucky, Awakened Elemental Damage with attacks is really good. Trinity Support is the next gem, and this gives you a big boost to both elemental damage and elemental penetration if you've got Trinity active. In a nutshell, Trinity occurs when you have 2 elemental damage types overlapping each other. An example would be you hit someone once and the biggest elemental damage is lightning, and then you hit another enemy or the same enemy and the biggest hit is cold, then Trinity procs. Ignore the fact it's called Trinity, you only need 2 elements to overlap. So if one of your elements is way below the other 2, it doesn't matter. When you hit an enemy, you'll see this visual appear on your toolbar. When all the sections are coloured like this, you've got Trinity. If only 2 sections are full and it stays that way while you're mapping, it means one of your damage types is too high compared to the others. As we use a lightning skill as our main damage dealer, Trinity is really easy to proc, because as shown in this image, Lightning Strike has a huge variable damage range. To ensure Trinity procs, you just want to make sure your lightning damage is the biggest damage dealer and it's a good chunk higher than the other 2 elements. When you add Mark of the Elder and Blizzard Crown into the build, they both add flat cold. So if your cold starts catching up with your lightning, you may want to swap added cold for added lightning in your gems. However, if you've got a high lightning roll on your claw, this should never be an issue. So the auras I recommend running is Anger, Precision, Grace and Defiance banner. You're going to pick up reservation nodes on the tree and specific ones for Grace and Precision that allow you to run all 4 gems. It's important not to go too low on mana, as one of the cast and damage taken skills that we use does use a lot of mana. So I'll just quickly go over what these auras do and why we run them. Anger gives us a lot of flat damage. It has good Watcher's Eyes at endgame. It also has much easier stat requirements to hit than the other added elemental damage aura, which is Wrath. Precision is really important as it gives us much needed accuracy and crit chance. If you don't run a precision gem, your chance to hit is likely to only be around 80%. Grace boosts our evasion a ton and gives a big boost to survivability. And then finally, Defiance banner for such a cheap reservation boosts evasion and armor. So it's a nice small buff to our evasion for very little cost. It can also be placed against bosses for 15% less damage taken and an increase in our aura effects. I'm really bad and quite lazy, so I always forget to place it, but I'd certainly recommend doing it on tough fights. So we'll move on to the movement skills, and our main movement skill we're going to use is Whirling Blades, and we link it to faster attacks. I personally run it in a 4-link with life tap so that the skills use life, and then I also link Wither in Step to this. Now you don't have to run life tap with these skills or link it to Wither in Step, but somewhere in the build you have to run Wither in Step, and we're going to come onto that shortly. You're also going to need an unlinked flame dash somewhere in your gear to get over gaps, as whirling blades can't traverse gaps. So you'll use whirling blades to quickly get across the map, and only use flame dash when you have a gap to cross. Now before we move on from the movement skills, let's talk about Wither in Step, as it's a hugely important and often overlooked aspect of the build. At first glance, it looks like a skill that just gives you a bog standard elusive effect and then expires as soon as you do anything, and it then goes on to cooldown. But the importance of this gem is in its description and the interaction it has with our other form of elusive through Nightblade support. Now I mentioned Nightblade support was our best gem, as a max elusive buff gives a ton of crit chance, loads of crit multi, and a chance to avoid damage entirely. However, the buff slowly ticks down and it can't be reactivated until it reaches 0. So it sounds like when we first hit an enemy we do great damage, but this slowly decreases over time until we have a minimal to no buff at all. But let's look at the wording of the Wither in Step gem, and it's this part of the wording that's really important. And it removes existing elusive effect before granting another buff. What this means is that if we have Wither in Step on our left click on our move button, that we're constantly triggering it. Why this matters is that it allows us to remove Nightblade support elusive effect and essentially reset it whenever we move. Now it's easy to explain with a bit of slowed down footage. So as you can see here, we move into this group of enemies and attack, and we get a big elusive effect, but it starts to tick down fairly quickly. However, as soon as we move, Wither in Step activates its own buff and it removes the Nightblade support buff. And then as you can see, we move on to the next pack of enemies and attack, and we get that full elusive buff again. This interaction gives a ton more DPS and sustainable damage, and should be part of everyone's build. We'll now move on to the cast when damage taken setup, and this will be a 4-link of cast when damage taken, immortal cool, increased duration, and inspiration. This gets stronger as you get endurance charges in the build, as you can get the duration of the skill up much higher. But for now it's still the best aura that we can run on a cast when damage taken setup. The level requirements on your cast when damage taken gem has to be higher or equal to the skill gem, which in this case is immortal cool. So before I get to endgame, I like to keep cast when damage taken at 3 and immortal cool at 5. And we're linking inspiration to it, as it lowers the mana cost of the skill. And this then means at endgame you can push the gem levels higher if you wanted to. And then the last set of gems needed is a totem setup. Now this setup is really up to you, it depends how many buttons you want to have to press in your build. I personally have to try in various different combinations. I only run an Ancestral Protector linked with multi-totem and Culling Strike. Ancestral Protector when placed just gives us a really good boost to attack speed. Now at some point in the build we'll be dropping the Culling Strike gem, as we're going to get this either on the tree or on some gear. Now if you want more DPS, you can link an Ancestral War Chief to your totems. So you would need to drop your War Chief and then your Protector, and it will give you more damage. But the build already has a few buttons in, so I prefer not to recommend it. Just make sure if you do go this route that it's not a Vaal Ancestral War Chief, as we want our only Vaal gem to be Vaal Lightning Strike, because they all share souls. The reason we run a multi-totem is the quality on it gives us more totem placement speed, so it just means there's less chance of us dying when we're trying to put a totem up. So the last setup you need is a curse setup, and in 3.17 it's now much easier to add a mark to an enemy with the new support gem Mark on Hit. All you need to do is link this gem to Assassin's Mark and you get a curse on hit with any attack in your build. Now there is a cooldown for which details are not released yet, and it does apply a slightly weaker version of the curse. However, since marks no longer have a duration and the highest mark we could put on was level 12, this could end up being a buff. In endgame juice content, I'll also run a portal linked to cast on death in case I die in the middle of a juiced Delhi map or blight encounter. Now I'm not going to touch on leveling or early maps, as this is going to be covered in another section later on. What I'm going to go through is the gear and stats that you should aim for to be able to reasonably clear the majority of the content in the game. I will also include examples of very high-end gear if you wanted to push the build to the max. How to craft these items will also briefly be covered in the gearing section later. This part itself is just a purely look at the gear. So let's start with the claw. Personally, I like to use imperial claws as the 1.6 attacks per second means you can get lots more life gain on hit. The other option is a Gemini claw as it gives both mana and life gain on hit. Now the two most important stats I've found for the claw after various testing is attack speed and crit chance. Ideally, you're looking for a claw with minimum of T2 attack speed and crit chance. The next important aspect is having an open prefix to craft elemental penetration, as this adds a lot of damage. This is the Syndicate unlock. Now other than that, you want as much elemental damage as you can get on the claw, prioritizing lightning. Now this is a claw I used in my SSF playthrough, and as you can see it lacks a lot of flat damage, but the other stats make it a decent claw. At first glance I thought this was bad, but every claw I had dropped that I thought was better when plugged into Path of Building was a downgrade. In trade you can definitely aim for better. Regarding an endgame claw, you're basically looking for those stats, but T1, T2 across the board. And the easiest way to do it is to get a claw with either T1 lightning or T1 attack speed fractured on it, and then use essences to craft the claw. But be warned, these will be super expensive. You ideally don't want this claw to be influenced, as it's going to bloat the mod pool, making it more difficult to hit the mods that you're looking for. So we'll now move on to the shield. And for the shield, this is where you want to aim to pick up 20% spell suppression as a minimum and 30% ailment avoidance. Any extra stats you can get in it are nice. The shield will either need life already on it or an open prefix to craft up to 70 life. End game, there's loads of options for shields such as +2 minimum power charges. You can get +2 max res. There's lots of different options if you want to push the build further. The base is really up to you. I like to use a dexterity base for the movement speed, but the implicit that the spike shields get for additional spell suppression can also be handy. Helmet wise, the best in slot is definitely a Blizzard Crown, as it gives a lot of flat cold damage. Here you just want to pack as much life and resistances as you can. It's also a really good option to craft physical damage taken as fire, which is a Corel unlock in Syndicate. Enchantment wise, you're looking for Lightning Strike pierces 3 additional targets. If this is really expensive, you can just not run an enchantment or find a cheaper one that benefits the build and look to get +2 pierce on your boots. Endgame is pretty much going to be the stats we've discussed, just T1, T2 across the board. Now we'll move on to the body armor, and there are tons of options for this. I'll firstly go over the chest I would aim for early on in the league, and that's a 6-link either Elder or Hunter body armor that's item level 84, because these can hit 1.5% chance to crit with your attacks. And there's only one tag for attack and crit on these body armors, so it makes it really, really easy to actually craft in Harvest. Along with this mod, you're just looking for as much life and resistances as you can, and then what I would recommend is that you craft percentage of life as extra energy shield, which is a Gravicious unlock, because we're going to be going up to Ghost Dance to take advantage of that. Unique wise, you can always opt for a Pharaoh's Fur or a replica Pharaoh's Fur, as then you'll have max frenzy and either power or endurance charges all the time. Another option I've seen people run, but it can be difficult for strength requirements, is a 6-link Lionized Vision chest, because this has built-in pierce, so you don't then need to worry about crafting boots or getting an enchantment on your helmet. If you're looking for end game, I would go a Crusader Warlord body armor with 15% chance to gain a power charge on crit and gain 1 endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently. The gloves you're aiming for early on are Hunter gloves that are item level 80 or above, and the mod you're looking for is strikes target 1 additional enemy. What this means is that we don't have to run Ancestral Call in our 6-link, so it's a good boost to DPS whilst keeping our clear decent. Early on, these are fairly difficult to craft because you may have limited currency, so basically just hitting that mod is what you're looking for, and then anything with life and resistances is a bonus. If you have an open prefix, craft life. If you have an open suffix, then craft a resistance. End game, you'll be looking at Warlord Hunter gloves. and you want +1 to maximum frenzy charges, and then you want the elevated strike mod, which allows you to strike 2 additional targets. Now they are expensive, but they're definitely worth aiming for end game if it's a character you want to take all the way. I like to get Pierce on boots, and for that it would be item level 80 Hunter boots with the +2 Pierce mod on it. Now the mod isn't super rare. It also means you don't have to worry about enchanting the Blizzard Helm, which can be difficult to do yourself or expensive to buy on trade. As usual, you're looking for life, resist and movement speed. The boots shown here are what I had in my short SSF playthrough. In trade you could certainly do better, but the stats on here is what you're looking for. If you don't have movement speed on boots, the best craft to do is movement speed plus chance to gain onslaught on kill, but I somehow haven't unlocked this from Syndicate yet in this playthrough. There's a couple of enchants you can use on the boots. There's the one on the boot shown, which is adds lightning damage if you've not killed recently, and there's another which adds elemental penetration if you haven't killed recently. They're both really good for bosses. If you're super rich, you can look to add Tailwind into the mix, which can also roll on Hunter boots. If you're looking for a cheap and really good unique, Dark Grey Vectors are a great option, as they give damage and lots of extra stats based on the amount of frenzy charges you have. Personally, I wouldn't run them unless they're paired with something like Pharaoh's Fur, as for phased bosses in endgame, if all your charges fall off, it can feel really bad. Obviously there's ways around this, like increase the length of your charges, but early on, for a cheap boot, they can be a really good boost to DPS, so don't overlook them. I've also seen people running Voidwalker boots, as these give +5 pierce, and they give you 25% chance to avoid projectiles, but they don't have any life or resist on them. If you're going for the Pierce helmet, I would recommend just getting a really well-rolled pair of two-tone boots with high life, movement speed and resistances. For a belt, you're looking for something with elemental damage with attacks as high a roll as you can get, some life and some resistances. Early on in mapping, I like to run a heavy belt, as strength can be a bit of an issue until you get your lethal pride jewel. And then later on, I'd look to transition into a Stygian Vise. You can then add a jewel in that just has tons of flat damage and flat damage to claw attacks. And then use whatever catalyst suits the mods that you have. If you have a really high elemental damage attack roll, then you're going to want to use attack catalysts on it. Endgame, for doing wave 30 simulacrums and juice content, you're obviously going to be looking for a headhunter, as the buffs you get from it can really carry the build. I personally have never had one on the build, but that's what most people will use. For rings, we need the Mark of the Elder, and that comes from Uber Elder, and it needs to be paired with a Shaper ring to get the buffs from the ring. But now that we don't need Mark on Hit on this ring, I recommend getting as many stats into this ring as you can, from attack mods, attributes, life and resistances. For amulets, there's lots of options, but 100% recommend an Agate amulet, as it gives you strength and intelligence, which you might struggle to get in the build. You need life, and after that, it really depends what you want to prioritize. In this example, I've stacked stats, as it means I don't have to worry about it on my gear, so it's easier to upgrade individual items when I need to. For prefixes, additional ones you want to look for are elemental damage with attacks and flat elemental damage. If you've got an open prefix, minus mana cost can be a good thing to craft, as it just makes the build run smoother. The item doesn't need to be influenced, so this should be a fairly cheap item for the build. For anoints, if you have 6 frenzy charges, I would go with Divine Judgment. It's nice and cheap. If you've got 7 or more frenzy charges, Disciple of the Slaughter is definitely better and worth the extra upgrade cost. For endgame, if you want to push the build further, I'd recommend an All's Uprising with Determination Reservation. It just means you can then run a free Determination aura. We run Defiance Banner, so that gets boosted even more. You then just add a simple Granite Flask into the build, and you've already got a decent stack of armor to go along with your evasion. And then finally we'll move on to flasks. I like to run a Life Flask with Bleed Immunity. I run a Jade Flask for extra evasion, a Diamond Flask for lucky crit, a Silver Flask for onslaught, and then a Quicksilver Flask just for increased movement speed. When you get rich, a Bottle Faith is a great addition, as it boosts your DPS an absolute ton. And like I said, if you end up getting more armor into the build, I would drop a flask to run a Granite Flask. At this stage, you're probably going to be able to drop the diamond flask if you're really stacked, because you've probably got 100% crit chance without it. But obviously look before you remove a flask to see what difference it's going to make. And for jewels, Lethal Pride Jewel is the only unique jewel that we use in the build, and it is an important part of the build as it not only gives us a big boost to strength, but it can also help us get some really good mods like 5% chance to deal double damage and 10% chance to intimidate on hit. Ideally, you want both of these mods, but it's quite rare to roll and can cost a lot of divine orbs to do that. For your remaining jewel, you want 7% life and then something like crit multi with elemental skills and crit multi with lightning skills. You can roll all of these on one jewel. It can be quite costly, but it can be a decent boost to DPS. You can also use this to balance off resistances or stats that you might need. Now we'll move on to defenses. So for defenses, we keep it pretty simple until we get endgame geared, and we can add in some more forms of defense. If you build the character correctly and you don't play too recklessly, taking on, maps of that, looking at the mods to make sure you've not got a vulnerability map with tons of extra damage, you should have a fairly smooth and safe progression to the early 90s. So for the defenses, we have Grace for evasion, and we boost this up using Flask's Defiance banner, and you can shore it up with nodes on the tree if you wanted to. We run a castle and damage taken and immortal call for short bursts of survivability, and this gets stronger if you can get endurance charges into the build. We have 100% spell suppression, which means we take half damage from all spells. Now this is amazing against fights like Uber Elder and Cirrus, where most of the attacks are spell based. We have 100% ailment avoidance, so we cannot be affected by chill, shock or ignite. We're corrupted blood immune from the tree, and we can also pick up some chaos resistance from these nodes too. We have Ghost Dance, which lets us recover our energy shield when we're hit, and that's why we craft energy shield on the chest, as it gives us a good chunk of effective HP. We have a small amount of block from our shield. It's only around 24 to 25%. Doesn't sound significant, but it still means we block 1 in 4 hits. We've got lots of life gain on hit and life leech, which essentially means as long as you don't get one shot, you're going to be able to heal through most attacks. We have phase in from our Ascendancy, so we can move through enemies. When you start taking on tough content, you do have the option of adding endurance charges in, either through a chest as mentioned in the gearing section, or if you use cluster jewels, there's a small armor cluster jewel that grants the same mod. You can add blind into the build from a jewel or the passive tree. You could also look at getting determination into the build with an All's Uprising, which means you can then gear your character with armor and evasion gear to get both a really good amount of evasion and armor. You can top this up by adding an armor flask into the build. So they quickly summarize the defenses for the build. It doesn't sound like a lot, but after having a few playthroughs this league, this is more than enough on softcore. If you're hardcore, you obviously might want to look more about getting another layer of defense in, but this build guide is really primarily aimed at softcore players. Later on in the video, I'm going to talk about how to craft or buy the items as cheaply as possible, but for now we'll move on to the passive tree. Now the endgame passive tree will look different for lots of players depending on what gear you're running and what stats and resistances you have. What I'm going to try and do is run through the important nodes on the tree, but all the passive trees and leveling trees are available in the path of building. But let's look at the key parts of the tree that you should always include. So the main claw wheel gives us lots of attack speed, crit chance and crit multi. The most important mastery here is skills supported by Nightblade have 40% increased effect of elusive. If we move further down, the dagger wheel here is also really important, as although we don't use a dagger, the nodes give us crit multi with the mastery, and the main node here gives us even more elusive effect. The early wheel across here gives us elemental penetration and a lot of elemental damage, and we can add a mastery that adds increased effect of non-damaging ailments, which means we can boost our shock and chill even higher. On the crit wheel here, we take another ailment mastery, which also increases the non-ailment effect from critical strikes and will be critting nearly all of the time. The precision wheel here is needed for both accuracy and attack speed. It also has a mastery where we can get 100% precision reservation efficiency. Now this means it's 100% increase, so it's not no cost at all. 100% is basically 50, so you halve the cost of your precision. The reservation wheel here, along with the mastery, is mandatory to fit our auras in. And we also take the life wheel here, as it has a mastery that increases the mana efficiency of grace. Now you do need to get leech for both mana and life somewhere. This can either be the 2 nodes on the tree here, or as I've done, you can path up to this claw wheel. Now these claw nodes are not that great, but if you don't have accuracy on gear, you may need to path here to get a 100% chance to hit. If you don't need accuracy, I would not path up here. I would just take the 2 leech nodes and spend the extra points elsewhere. This small crit section up here is really only good if you don't have 100% crit chance. If you're capped on crit, these nodes won't do that much. I've taken these 2 nodes here as they're really good for filling in resistances. If you're short, they also offer evasion and max cold resistances. It also falls within the lethal pride range. So if you have a really decent stat from your lethal pride jewel here, it's probably worth pathing here anyway. But if you don't need the resistances, I wouldn't take these 2 nodes. There's also attribute nodes handily here, which if you need intelligence or strength, it can be a short-term fix until you balance your gear. The spell suppression nodes here are really good, as they give lots of spell suppression, slightly boost the amount of damage we suppress, and the mastery is really handy. It gives us basically 100% crit chance if we've got capped spell suppression. Now if we move down to the bottom of the tree, there's a few nodes to point out. So these nodes here give Assassin's Mark Cullen Strike, but if you have Cull elsewhere, you don't need these nodes. There's also these nodes here, which if you're stacked on crit, they may not do that much for you, but for most builds, these nodes are going to be really, really good. They essentially give us loads of crit chance and crit multi for projectile attacks, and Lightning Strike has a projectile tag on the gem. Now there's 4 Ellie nodes here that are decent but not amazing, but I would be taking these if I didn't have to take other nodes to boost up my accuracy and my crit chance. I could drop those nodes and add these, as they would be more damage. Now there's lots of different ways to build this tree once you hit endgame, and it does really depend on what gear you have, what resistances you have, and what stats you have. If you do get stuck, I'd recommend using POE Ninja to see what other people are doing, or just have a play around with path of building, removing and adding nodes and seeing what difference it makes. Now I'm not going to spend any more time on the tree, as they're all available in the path of building, but I did want to give an overview and explain a few things rather than just point people directly to the POB. Now let's move on to gearing and leveling the build. I'm going to bring out a separate leveling video so as not to waste too much time in the guide, and a link to that guide will be in the video description. I thought it's easier just to show a quick matrix of when I think you should look to progress the build and how it performs at certain stages. So when you enter maps on your 4-link Spectral Helix setup, you'll be fine all the way through the white tier maps, so tier 1 to 5. You can push a bit higher if you had to. I, for example, completed the first 2 Maven boss invitations in both Haywalk Hamlet and Lyra Arthane before getting a 5-link. Once you get your 5-link Val Lightning Strike, the build's fine until yellow tier maps and in Uberlab, although Uberlab is more comfortable on a 6-link. You can push to lower tier red maps with this, but it does feel a little bit uncomfortable on bossing. Once you get a 6-link but without Ancestral Call, you should be able to comfortably clear T14 plus maps, although bosses can take a few seconds to die. You'll be able to kill Conquerors and Guardians, but the fights will be fairly slow. When you get your Strike Gloves and you run in a 6-link without Ancestral Call, Conquerors and Guardians will feel much better, and as long as you know the Cirrus encounter, AA as possible with the Strike Gloves. Then, as you start adding the rest of the gear listed in the guide, the build will perform as per the SSF showcase at the beginning of the video. And if you want to, you can then push it even further with stuff like Awakened Gems and double influence items if you really wanted to flex. So let's look a bit more in depth into how to craft the gear. So for the helmet, as I said, it's a Blizzard Crown. You want to hit up rituals to get the base, and then really you just want to roll life essences on it until you get a roll that you're happy with. For the body armor, you can use any attack or crit reroll in Harvest, and it will guarantee the crit mod that we're looking for. So it needs to be T1, it can roll with T2 or T1. It needs to be T1 to get the most crit chance. And just do this until you've got one with a decent life roll and an open prefix to do the energy shield craft when you unlock it. Now the claw is hard to craft without a fractured base, and a lot of it comes down to luck, but the best essences are Zeal because attack speed pretty much makes the most difference to the build. If you want to buy essences, I would buy whatever's cheapest out of Hatred, Wrath, Zeal or Anger. As mentioned, you can also use attack and speed rerolls in Harvest. For boots, if you're going for +2 pierce, there's not really a way to target this as it doesn't have any tags. It is a prefix though, and in our boots we want life, which is a prefix, movement speed, which is a prefix, and pierce. This means if you're rolling with essences and it's not a life or movement speed essence, make sure you use an essence that adds a suffix. So ones to use on here, which you might not want to use on any gear, are ones that add strength or intelligence. You could just spam as many of these as you have and try and get lucky. It's not a particularly hard craft to hit, and if you're going for +2, it really is RNG as to how you craft the item. Once you have the +2 pierce, you can then drop the nodes from the tree. For the belt, if you're going for LE damage, then just roll it with attack in Harvest, or you can use Hatred, Wrath or Anger essences to get resistances on the belt. Lastly, we're going to move on to the Hunter gloves. You can use attack Harvest plants, but the mod is pretty rare with these, so you might have to go through lots to hit the mod. You can again try and essence craft them and get lucky, and just use any essences that add a mod that's useful for the gloves. The two ways I normally look to craft these is either chaos spamming, alching and scouring, or to me the best and cheapest method is to alt augment on magic until you hit the mod, and then you regal and then you craft either life or resistances. Now according to Craft of Exile, it takes an average of 191 alts to hit the mod, or 91 chaos orbs. So have a look on the market to see what these gloves are selling for. If you can pick them up cheaper than that, that's probably the better option. Now if anyone has any crafting tips, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll pin the most useful one, or merge them all together into one comment myself and pin that. Now that covers the majority of the guide, so let's move on to the conclusion and outro. There are 2 filters on my profile which you can follow if you want a simple leveling filter for a claw character. The one for leveling through the campaign is called A1 Claw, and then there's one called Claw Mapping that will cover you in maps. It's a pretty loose filter that basically highlights Imperial claws and deck shields. Once you get into red maps, I'd recommend going to a stricter filter. We also have a very active Lightning Strike Discord going, which you can join by following this link. There's lots of experienced players here, and we all help each other out to learn about the build and the league. There's a written guide on the POE forums, which I'll try and update as regularly as I can, and the link will be in the video description. So that wraps up the build. Feel free to leave questions in the comments, the written guide or the Discord. If I can't answer, I'm sure someone can. Just ensure you're doing as much research on your own as you can, as at League Start most people are going to be too wrapped up in playing the game. So I hope you all have an amazing League Start. Thanks for watching, take care, and see you in the next video.